There is one particular story that Maximilian associates with this place. The year the airport was completed was the year he was born and abandoned immediately. At the age of 8, he was adopted and sent to live in Germany. Holding the hands of his adoptive parents, he boarded a plane for the first time. That was how he arrived here. This story is now 22 years old. He truly looked like a foreigner. He once had a Korean name, but legally it no longer existed. Only one person continued to call him Sojin. One day, Jae announced that he was getting married. Returning to Korea was the most impulsive decision of his life, a price he paid for his love for a friend. That was the reason behind his escape to Korea. When Maximilian met Jae on the plane, he asked why he was flying to Korea when his wedding was just around the corner. Jae replied that he thought spending a month near him might help him understand why he ran away. He crossed the skies for him. A few weeks earlier, Maximilian had been walking calmly through the international airport in his uniform. He recalled how, as a child, his adoptive parents had taken him to a plane where the pilot showed the awestruck boy the cockpit. It was then he promised himself he would become a pilot. Approaching one of the airport staff, Maximilian introduced himself as the captain of the crew heading to Singapore and mentioned that he was looking for his team. The man pointed out that the senior first officer, Chan, was standing nearby. They greeted each other. Chan remarked that he thought today's captain was supposed to be a foreigner. Maximilian replied that though he had a foreign name, he was indeed Korean. If he had used his Korean name, things would have been simpler, but legally, it no longer existed. Chan asked Maximilian to follow him. On the way, he inquired if Maximilian was from Germany and had transferred from Lufthansa. Maximilian confirmed. He added that he hoped for a smooth collaboration on their first flight together. Chan remarked that in that case, a full briefing was in order. During the briefing, Maximilian introduced himself, stated that he would be their captain on the flight to Singapore, and asked Chan to proceed with the meeting. Chan announced that they were scheduled to depart at 9:15 and needed to be ready in 10 minutes. As the meeting went on, Maximilian stared out the window, reflecting on how, just a month ago, he couldn't have imagined living in Korea. When Jae had announced his engagement, Maximilian had realized that for 15 years, he had harbored an unrequited love for him. Jae had shared that his fiancée's name was Jella and that Maximilian also knew her. They had been classmates. Maximilian asked when their relationship had begun. Max understood that Jae had always treated him as a friend. Jae explained that their relationship was recent, and after a conversation about marriage, he decided to propose. Maximilian wondered if Jae had made the decision so lightly. He didn't have the courage to witness it all unfold. It was fear on his part, but to protect himself, he secretly prepared to leave for Korea without telling Jae. Even now, he avoids him. Maximilian sat in the pilot's seat, receiving clearance for takeoff. Later, as the plane soared through the sky, a flight attendant brought meals to the cockpit, fish for the captain and Korean cuisine for the first officer. As the flight attendant left, Chan, over lunch, asked Maximilian if he was married. Maximilian replied that he wasn't in a relationship. Chan remarked that it seemed the flight attendant liked him, as her gaze had been fixed on him. He shared that he himself was married to a colleague. Chan recounted how he had first met his future wife when she entered the cockpit. Their eyes met, and he asked for her number. Soon after, they went on their first date. Back in Germany, Maximilian had briefly dated a flight attendant. At the time, he didn't fully understand his own preferences, but he had been curious about Jae's reaction. Jae had only said that he was proud of him and encouraged him to keep it up. Yet again, Maximilian found himself thinking about Jae. The plane landed in Singapore. Maximilian saw numerous missed calls and messages from Jae. He thought it would be better if Jae focused on preparing for his wedding. In truth, Maximilian had never imagined that Jae would spend his life with anyone other than him. The life he had envisioned shattered into countless pieces that day. The price of loving a friend. That was the reason for his escape to Korea. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he saw his crew. Chan suggested they go out for dinner together. They all went to a restaurant, but Maximilian couldn't shake his melancholy mood. One of the flight attendants asked the captain if the food was not to his liking. Maximilian assured her that, on the contrary, he enjoyed it. He explained that he was simply lost in thought. Suddenly, his phone rang. He saw it was Jae calling. He answered, and Jae asked where he was. Maximilian replied that he was at a restaurant in Singapore, having just finished his meal and stepped outside. Jay asked if Maximilian thought that was what he meant, and if he truly intended to stay in Korea permanently. Maximilian asked if Jay had called his brother, adding that he already knew everything. So why ask? Jay asked what had gotten into him, pointing out that he had even left a good job. Maximilian replied that the pay was good here. They had been looking for a captain, as if the job had found him instead of the other way around. Jay said that nevertheless, Maximilian should have discussed it with him and told him about it. He admitted he now felt like a fool. Maximilian asked if it really mattered how he felt. He added that he hadn't known about Jay's engagement either, but still hadn't said anything about it. Jay acknowledged the point and suggested they talk about everything in person. Maximilian never mustered the courage to send regards to Jella, unable to deny that jealousy was the reason. In the end, Maximilian would stay in Korea, and Jay would marry and live his life in Germany. Perhaps they will exchange calls a few times a year, and every few years they might even meet in person. Maximilian believes that over time his feelings will finally fall into place. Suddenly, his crew emerges from the restaurant, and Chan announces that they are heading back to the hotel. The next day, at the airport in Korea, Chan gives Maximilian his phone number. Chan asks where he lives, wondering if it's in a neighborhood close to the airport. Maximilian explains that he only recently moved in, and that the house is still completely empty. He then asks if housewarming parties are a thing in Korea. Chan confirms and asks if Maximilian is planning to host one. Maximilian replies that he will organize a party once his belongings arrive. Until then, he will need to make some new acquaintances. Chan reassures him that it will be easy, joking that everyone already knows about the handsome single captain who has joined their ranks. Maximilian smiles, admitting that it's flattering to hear. Chan asks when Maximilian's next flight is and whether their schedules align. Maximilian replies that he has 2 days off and then a flight to Frankfurt in 3 days. Maximilian reflects on how he left Frankfurt as if fleeing, and now he is returning. Was there any point to his escape? The flight concludes. The first officer announces the preparation for landing. They touch down at Frankfurt Airport. Whether for better or worse, the moment he arrives here, memories of Jay flood his mind. As he strolls through the city, he notices a billboard featuring a man who looks strikingly similar to Jay, named Daniel Lee. The deep-set eyelids, the wide almond-shaped eyes, the perfectly straight brows, and a towering height of around 190 meters. Everything about him reminds Maximilian of Jay. Suddenly, Maximilian runs into his brother, Chris, who greets him and asks how he's doing. At the age of 8, when Maximilian was adopted, they fought every single day. But as time passed, they grew up and became deeply attached to one another. Maximilian came to realize that Chris was a good brother. When he left Germany as if running away, Chris was the one who helped him without asking questions. And today, despite the hours-long journey, Chris was delighted to rush to see him. Chris tells Maximilian to let him know his schedule next time and asks if they could meet once a month. They sit at a table, and Maximilian promises to inform him ahead of time in the future. Chris, who married Sylvia last year, mentions that his wife also wanted to come. Maximilian asks him to send her his regards and promises they will meet again. Chris asks if Jay has called yet and wonders if they had a falling out. Maximilian admits that they did, but Chris urges him to stop lying. He asks if Max had truly loved him deeply. Maximilian laughs, realizing he can't hide anything from his brother. He admits that in truth, he still loves Jay. Outside, it begins to rain as Maximilian's plane takes off once again. The crew praises his skillful takeoff, noting the heavy rain and strong winds, and admits they thought he would accelerate sooner. Maximilian replies that there's nothing extraordinary about it. He was simply cautious about the potential for abrupt changes in wind direction and speed. A flight attendant enters the cockpit chatting with her team. The crew asks what the commotion outside is about. She explains that there's an exceptionally handsome passenger in business class, and the flight attendants are arguing over who gets to serve him. The first officer jokingly asks if a celebrity is on board. The flight attendant says she doesn't think so, but wonders if they know Daniel Lee, as the passenger resembles him greatly. At her words, Maximilian feels a wave of tension. He asks her if he can see the passenger list. Scanning the list, he confirms that Jay is indeed on the flight. The first officer compliments Maximilian on a smooth takeoff and asks if he plans to use the rest area. But Maximilian declines, saying he has someone to meet. The walk to Jay is astonishingly quiet. There is no need to search for his seat, Among the sleeping passengers in the dim cabin, there is one man with his light on. It's Jay. Maximilian approaches him and asks why he boarded a flight bound for Korea, pointing out that his wedding is just around the corner. Jay explains that he thought spending a month near Maximilian might help him understand why he ran away. Maximilian takes him to a private room and asks if Jella knows what he's doing and that he's in Korea. Jay says she partially knows. He told her he'd be working from home for a month. Maximilian asks why he's doing something so reckless. Jay replies that there's still time before the wedding, and this is something of a pre-wedding bachelor retreat. For a moment, Maximilian is overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Jay touches his hand and asks if Maximilian left because of him. Maximilian denies it. When they arrive in Korea, Maximilian asks Jay where he plans to stay, at a hotel or if he has other arrangements. Jay asks why he would stay at a hotel when he could stay at Maximilian's place. Maximilian finds the idea unsettling, something he hadn't even considered. Jay smiles and asks if something is wrong. Despite his misgivings, Maximilian thinks that someone determined to stay close to him for a month can't possibly live in a hotel, and reluctantly tells Jay to follow him. Outside the door, Jay asks Maximilian for the key so he can open it. Maximilian explains that most doors in Korea open with a password which Jay will need to remember. Jay remarks that he had been about to ask for a spare key but realizes now it won't be necessary. Back in Germany, they had exchanged spare keys to their apartments. It had felt so natural. Jay hadn't entrusted his key to a nearby friend, but instead gave it to Maximilian, who lived an hour's drive away. Perhaps that had always been the problem in their relationship. Perhaps everything that tied them together would eventually unravel. They step inside the apartment. Jay looks around and sees that the place is completely empty. Max explains that he only recently moved in, not even a week ago, so the apartment is still empty, and Jay is his very first guest. Jay replies that he's not a guest and declares that he'll take the room near the door. As Jay walks away, Max calls after him, insisting that this isn't an escape and urging him to just leave. He explains that it would be uncomfortable for him to work like this, especially since Jay has someone waiting for him. Jay asks if Max feels uneasy because of his presence. Max denies it. Jay smiles, saying that's perfect, so there's nothing to worry about. Suddenly, Jay remembers he has somewhere to go. He asks Max if he can borrow his car, but before waiting for a response, he's already out the door. For a moment, Jay's expression as he headed for the door felt completely unfamiliar to Max. He couldn't understand what Jay was trying to resolve. A thought suddenly strikes Max. Maybe Jay didn't come because of him, but for some personal reason of his own. It's not because of me, Max tells himself, unsure whether to feel relieved or disheartened by this realization. One day, when Max steps out of his room, he finds the kitchen stocked with various utensils and household items. He asks Jay what it's all about. Jay replies that the house was completely empty, so he went out and bought some basic supplies. Max asks for the receipt, promising to reimburse him. Jay brushes it off, saying there's no need and that Max can consider it payment for letting him stay. Jay adds that he'll deal with everything else after a shower, then tells Max to rest, reminding him of his flight tomorrow. Max tries not to give in to the suggestion. With an early flight the next morning, Max decides it's best to shower and go to bed. He's thankful there are 2 bathrooms in the apartment. Through the door, he hears Jay talking to Jella on the phone. Jay tells her that he's unsure about something, mentioning that, as Max had said, he really came here without any clear reason. He adds that he plans to stay a bit longer and then figure things out. He asks if it's still morning in Germany, saying he'll shower and then rest. For the first time, Max hears Jay speaking to his fiancée over the phone. He finds Jay's tone gentle, tender, and filled with care, sweet and endlessly affectionate. Max envies the simplicity of their exchange, imagining that they must talk like this every night. He feels an overwhelming jealousy toward Jella, as if she has stolen something precious from him. Even though Jay was never truly his. Once again, Max is piloting a flight. His first officer asks if he's feeling all right, noting that he looks tired. Max admits that he's a little fatigued, especially with another return flight ahead. The first officer offers to handle the landing for him, and Max gratefully agrees. As the plane lands, Max is impressed by the smoothness of the descent. He asks the first officer, Minu, how long he's been flying since obtaining his commercial pilot's license. Minu replies that he's logged about 2,000 hours. Minu asks if the landing was all right. Max compliments him, saying it was excellent. After the shift, Minu gives Max a ride home, and Max thanks him for the favor. Minu dismisses the thanks, saying that Max looked exhausted, and since it was on his way, it was no trouble at all. He casually mentions that he and Sonak were hired at the same time and asks if Max knows him. Max recalls that his first flight was with Sonuk. Minu says he's glad they're all acquainted and suggests they meet up more often since they live nearby. As Minu drives off, Jay suddenly appears and asks if Minu is one of Max's colleagues. Max confirms, mentioning that they had just flown together. Jay remarks that Minu seems like a nice guy. Max asks when Jay had the chance to notice him. Jay replies that he was just standing there watching and adds that it doesn't really matter whether someone is handsome or not. Placing a hand on Max's shoulder, Jay asks if there are any female pilots at his workplace and suggests that Max should take an interest in women. Max wonders what Jay is even hoping for. He shrugs off Jay's hand and says he's going to bed early because he's tired, then walks away. Long ago, when they were still teenagers, Jay had once asked Max if he wanted him to go with him somewhere. Max dreamt of that moment, and when he woke, he found Jay sitting beside him. Max asks why Jay isn't asleep. Jay replies that he had been, but the time difference woke him up, so he decided to do some work. Max asks why, in that case, he's in his room. Without answering directly, Jay tells Max that he talks in his sleep and that it sounded like he was dreaming about meeting his biological mother. When Max was 17, he learned that his birth mother had come to Germany to meet him. But he couldn't bring himself to face her. That was when Jay had offered to go with him. Encouraged by Jay's words, Max found the courage to go. They decided to wait for her in a small, quiet cafe. But his mother never showed up that day, leaving Max feeling abandoned for the second time. From that moment on, he resolved never to think of her again. Max gets out of bed and steps onto the balcony to smoke. Jay asks if he's all right. Max replies that it was 13 years ago, so of course, he's fine. Jay says that sometimes people carry pain for a lifetime, especially those who don't express their feelings openly. He adds that you have to ask Max the same thing 10 times before getting an answer. Max asks if Jay wants a cigarette, but Jay replies that he quit. Max asks when that happened. Jay says it's been about 6 months and remarks that it must have been that long since they last saw each other. He explains that Jella didn't like it, so he gave it up. Max lights a cigarette and tells Jay he's proud of him, while thinking to himself that he'll just have to get used to smoking alone now. He mentions that he has 5 days off, so as Jay suggested, they can have their guys' retreat. He asks Jay to think of something he'd like to do. Jay excitedly proposes a trip to Jeju. The next day, they arrive at the airport. Max sarcastically asks if it's really necessary to fly somewhere on his day off. Jay responds that the weather is perfect for a trip. Max realizes Jay isn't even listening to him. Still, it's their first trip together in a long time. Jay had always been the type to love spontaneous trips, often choosing Max as his companion. These trips were likely moments Max would never forget. He decides that since it happened this way, he might as well enjoy it, even if their relationship seems to be teetering on the edge of a break. After the flight, they go horseback riding. Jay says it was a great idea to come here and asks if Max agrees. Jay then inquires about Max's next flight. Max responds that he's heading to Bangkok and will stay there for 2 days. Jay says that while Max is away, he'll use the time to get some work done. Max suggests that Jay take the weekend to visit Germany, as being here alone might be uncomfortable for him. Suddenly, Jay asks if Max is truly okay. Max asks if Jay is worried about him. Jay counters by asking if that sounds like an answer. Max questions what exactly he said wrong. Jay asks what Max means by his evasive responses and why he's acting this way, especially when Jay set aside an entire month to come here. Jay adds that this is why Max keeps telling him to leave. Max asks Jay not to say it's because of him if he decides to stay, reminding him that he also came here for personal reasons. With those words, Max urges his horse forward, galloping away. Max knows he's been acting stranger by the day. His anger, misguided as it is, projects onto Jay, the very person who shows him genuine care. He believes it would have been easier if Jay hadn't taken such an interest in him. Then their relationship would be less complicated. 15 years ago, in the height of summer, Max had been playing video games with his friends, winning match after match with ease. It was during a friend's birthday party. That was the day he first met Jay. Jay had commented that it was the first time he'd seen another Asian, then asked if Max was Korean. Jay had then suggested they go to his house, saying it was boring to play the same games over and over. One more win, and Max could have set a record with 10 consecutive victories, but he agreed to go. They rode bikes together, continuing to get to know each other. Perhaps because they spent so much time together, Max's memories of that summer vacation were filled entirely with joy. Jay catches up to Max and remarks that he's always had a habit of sulking without any real reason. He adds that whenever Max acted that way, it made him reflect on what he might have done wrong, and he usually found an answer quickly. Max asks if he's found one this time. Jay lets himself fall onto the ground and says that yes, he has, but he's decided not to ask anymore, as the answer might not come, or it might cause discomfort. He pleads with Max to stop asking him to leave and simply allow him to stay. They arrive at the hotel and receive their room key cards. Max assumes they've been given separate rooms and notices that Jay doesn't seem to mind. In their past trips, they had always shared a room, but now Max thinks it's a bit odd for two grown men to split a single room. Jay suggests they have a glass of wine once Max has showered. When Max comes back, Jay pours him red wine. He teases that Max's old-fashioned taste hasn't changed. Max tells him not to make him laugh, pointing out that Jay himself has childish preferences. He asks how Jay can even drink white wine as it's so sweet. Suddenly, Jay excuses himself to take a phone call. Max reflects on how long it's been since they had such light-hearted conversations. He takes a sip of wine. Jay returns and comments on how red Max's face has become, asking if he's sure he can keep drinking. Max remarks on how quickly Jay came back and asks if the call was work-related. Jay says it wasn't. He's been swamped with work since arriving, but clarifies that this call wasn't about work. Jay explains that it was Jella who called. Max asks how she's doing. Jay replies that she's fine. She's been at her parents' house since yesterday and asked him to send Max her regards. Max hesitates, then asks if he can ask something personal. Jay encourages him to go ahead. Max asks if Jay was the one who proposed. Jay confirms that he was and asks why Max wants to know. Max admits that the idea still feels strange to him. Jay acknowledges that everything happened quickly and reassures Max that it's normal to feel that way. He admits that the way he announced his wedding wasn't considerate. He apologizes, but Max says there's no need to. Instead, he asks Jay to send his regards to Jella. Jay promises he will, and adds that they should try to become friends. Jay notes that if anything were to happen to him, or if he weren't around, Max and Jella would need to make decisions together. Noticing that Max has started drinking more, Jay gently tells him he's had enough. Jay remembers carrying Max home on his back once. He recalls how much fun they'd had that day. Suddenly, Jay stands and walks over to Max, tilting his chin upward. He says it's still just as much fun being with him now. Holding Max's chin, Jay comments on how much redder his face has gotten. He suggests that if Max isn't feeling well, they can go upstairs. In the elevator, Max asks Jay why he keeps staring at him. Jay replies that it's because Max is adorable. When he drinks, he always gets quiet and whines like a puppy, and tonight, even more so. Max wonders if he'll regret it later, but he feels tempted to suggest having one more glass together. He thinks he could simply ask Jay to come to his room. Given their relationship, it wouldn't be a big deal. Suddenly, Jay leans closer, looking directly into Max's eyes and asks what he's thinking about. Max steps out of the elevator, insisting that he's not thinking about anything, though he can't understand why such thoughts are running through his mind. He feels himself falling for Jay even more. But if he's being completely honest, all he can think about is wanting to be in Jay's arms. He knows he'll probably never admit it. The secrets between them only continue to grow. A few days later, Max finds himself at the international airport in Bangkok. Even at this hour, the heat feels oppressive. As he walks through the airport, someone calls out to him. It's Minu. Max asks if Minu had a flight. Minu explains that he's here for a ferry flight to pick up an aircraft. Max remarks that they've been running into each other more often lately. Max mentions that he booked a room at a hotel, which turns out to be the same one where Minu is staying. Minu suggests they have a drink together. At the bar, Max says he'll have a beer since he doesn't handle alcohol very well. Minu remarks that one wouldn't guess that at first glance. He asks if Max would prefer a cocktail instead, as it has less alcohol. Max agrees. Max observes that Minu doesn't seem to enjoy alcohol much. Minu confirms this, adding that he even took a bartending course once. He explains that he always approaches the things he loves sincerely. Minu shares that he heard from Sonic that Max plans to celebrate his housewarming soon. Max says that if Minu is free, he can come along with Sonic, though he doesn't know the exact date yet. Minu suggests the three of them have a small housewarming and order some chicken. Max laughs, saying it might actually end up being 4 people since his friend is currently staying with him. He adds that his friend will be there for a month. Max mentions that his friend is getting married soon, so he's feeling a bit anxious. Minu admits he went through something similar. Max says he didn't realize Minu was married. Minu clarifies that he isn't. His wedding was called off at the last moment. A canceled wedding. To Max, the thought feels strangely tempting. Max reflects that Jay must have a lot on his mind right now, and maybe the pressure of the wedding is why he came here to clear his head. Suddenly, Max notices a message from Jay, asking him to call when he's done with his flight. Max steps outside and calls Jay. Jay asks if he's landed already. Max replies that he's at a bar with an acquaintance. Jay tells him not to drink too much. Max assures him he knows his limits, and then asks if everything is all right. Jay explains that Chris called him. Max hopes Chris didn't say too much and asks what they talked about. Jay says that Chris asked him not to trouble Max and to return to Germany. He adds that both Chris and Max are trying to convince him, but he refuses to give in. Max tells Jay not to listen to them and to stay as long as he wants, reminding him that his home is Jay's home too. Jay asks if things are really the same as before. Max feels a pang of doubt, sensing Jay doesn't fully trust him. Jay's repeated questions feel uncharacteristic. Max realizes how confusing this must be for Jay. First, Max started avoiding him, and now Chris has called, asking him to leave. Only now does Max understand why he felt uneasy in the empty house. Max reassures Jay that everything is as it always was and asks him to stay. Jay promises to stay as long as he can. After the call, Max reflects that his love for Jay is what's causing him so much pain. Acknowledging this leaves him feeling guilty. As Max lights a cigarette, Minu approaches and asks if he's done with his call. Max says he's finished and explains that it was his friend on the line. Minu asks if it's the same friend who's staying with him. Max lights another cigarette and mentions that it seemed like something urgent. Minu jokes that it's nice to see another smoker. He says he often smokes in the neighborhood and asks if Max has ever seen him there. At that moment, Max remembers that they're practically neighbors. He explains that if you walk to the end of his street, there's a 24-hour convenience store. If you turn left from there, you'll find the Susan apartments. That's where he lives. Minu shares that he was supposed to move in there with his fiancée after their wedding, but now he lives there alone. He shrugs, saying it's nothing unusual. Out of 10 couples preparing for marriage, 2 of them end up separating. Max says he didn't know that and jokes that he should mention it to his friend. Minu asks if Max's friend took time off work and whether he's working at all. Max explains that his friend said he'd be working from home and that he seems to know what he's doing. He adds that it's not just a vacation, but an entire month. And he even traveled 1,000 kilometers to stay with him. Max explains they've been friends for over 15 years. Minu stubs out his cigarette and asks Max to let him know once they settle on a date for the housewarming. Minu says he has an early flight tomorrow, so he needs to leave. After taking a shower, Max feels a strange sense of shame. He hopes Minu didn't pick up on how he really feels about Jay. He reassures himself that if one didn't know the nature of his relationship with Jay, such a reaction would seem perfectly normal. Turning on the TV, Max sees a character in a movie who reminds him of Jay. Returning home after work, Max finds the apartment empty. It's only 9 p.m., too early to sleep. Entering Jay's room, he finds him fast asleep. Max hesitates, wondering whether to wake him, but instead feels a quiet yearning just to be near him. Suddenly, Jay stirs awake. Max apologizes, asking if he disturbed him. Jay says his eyes simply opened on their own. Max mentions that he ordered a second bed for him, as sleeping on the floor must be uncomfortable. Jay asks how Max liked Thailand, reminiscing about their previous trip there together. Max asks if there are still places they haven't visited. Jay lists many: Africa, the desert, the North Pole, the Amazon. Max jokes that what's left are places where they'd have to risk their lives. Jay laughs, saying if Max is so afraid, they might as well save those trips for when they're nearing the end of their lives. For a moment, Max couldn't say anything in response, because to him, Jay's words sounded like, "I'll stay by your side until the very end." He wonders what Jay's thoughts truly are and whether he will ever see love in his eyes, even if it's only the kind shared between friends. Suddenly, Jay's phone rings. It's Jella. Max asks why he isn't answering, prompting Jay to finally pick up the call and step out of the room. The next morning, Max asks Jay why he didn't wake him. Jay replies that he thought Max must have been tired. Jay mentions that there were several furniture deliveries in the morning. A TV, a sofa, everything arrived except the bed. He adds that now the place finally feels like someone actually lives there. Max shares that his next flight is to France. Jay smiles and says Max chose a truly amazing career, admitting that sometimes he regrets not insisting that he become a pilot too.